Yeah, a lot of her professional articles are on various social media and places all over the world. And also, Erika, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more once we get into this, how you are a royal member of something aviation in England. So remind me to get to that later, okay?
Okay.
All right, so she's the author of Chicken a Cockpit, which if any of you have read is a great book. And we're going to give one of those away tonight as a giveaway prize to one winner, and we'll announce that person at the end. But my name's Trimby Zabo, president of Women in Aviation Mile High Chapter. I can see right here that many of our board are on here. And we want to thank everybody for dialing in tonight and coming on in. And we are going to record this tonight so that we can share it. So that said, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Miss Erika Armstrong. Go ahead, Erika.
All right. Hey, everybody. Everybody hear me okay? Just nod your head. Yep, you got it. I see Audrey's got the thumbs up. Okay. If it gets echoey, just holler at me. So I figured tonight you guys would be kind of sick and tired of all the news about the COVID-19, trauma. So I thought we'd kind of shift gears and get our mind off of it for a little bit. So this is usually I'll do an hour-long presentation for the pilot brain. So I just pulled out just the highlights of it, so it'll be summarized into like just a 20-minute overview. And then afterwards, we can just kind of have a conversation, practice using our voice boxes. I know a lot of people have been, holed up away and alone and not talking to other people. So we'll have a little conversation when we get done here. So we'll see if we can get the technology to work here. But it's not changing screens, so hang on one second. Did it change screens for you? Yes, no? Yeah, okay.
I can still see the PowerPoint.
Okay.
There you go.
Perfect, okay. So this is my life story in aviation in about 30 seconds. Just a quick background. I see a lot of faces, you already know my background. Just real quickly, I've got about 30 years in aviation, both sides of the cockpit door. Part 91, Part 135, and then the airlines. I did a little bit of everything before I got onto the airlines. I flew for the Red Cross. I flew air ambulance. I flew hazmat, cargo, corporate pilot services, you name it, I gave it a try. Little dabbling of all the airplanes, 727, typed in the 727 of Citation series, Falcon 20, King Airs, 402s, a little bit of everything. I have 1 hour in a Russian yak, so if you ever see me at a bar, ask me about that, I'll tell you. I instructed a little bit of systems at NATCO, which was the Northwest Airlines training facility on the 727. And then right now I'm VP of Business Development and former Director of Instructional Design at Advanced Aircrew Academy. But I work with about 300 flight departments. So when you're ready to get into business aviation and that first job, just let me know and I can maybe hook you up with a position that's not posted out there. So I have a few connections. And then as Trimby said, I'm also teaching at MSU Denver right now. I'm teaching aircraft systems and propulsion. And now we're doing it all online. So it's been a learning curve for me and my students, but I think we got it now. So. But my interest in how pilots learn and train and how stress can affect the way a pilot thinks is actually started when I was a flight engineer. So after all those years of corporate flying, I finally got up to the airlines and couldn't actually fly. I had to sit back and I was a flight engineer for the first year. So I kept having these crazy dreams that I was forgetting how to fly. And so I decided to just kind of elevate my, my position at the flight engineers panel and pay more attention to the flight crew in front of me. What made a good captain, what made a good first officer, how did they, coordinate their CRM, what worked and what didn't, and then watching pilots, especially with my students, watching what works and how they learn. So let me see if I can get this. So the question always comes up, are pilots born or made? And the answer is a little bit of both. Pilots are definitely born. They have a certain characteristic, but great pilots are made. So we're just going to cover just a few of those topics today. So there are commonalities among all pilots that I've seen throughout my 30 years of flying. starting with pilots are visual learners. So all my core students, they have death by PowerPoint. Everything I teach is always backed up with a visual. So it's the words, it's hearing it, and it's seeing it. The other commonality is pilots have good spatial orientation. Some people have better orientation than others, but it's something that actually can be learned. We'll kind of talk about a little bit about how that happens. Let me back up my notes over here too. Low neuroticism, everybody thinks it's got having to do with being neurotic, but it's not. It just means you know how to think calmly during times of stress. It's emotional stability, and even if you don't instinctually have that, pilots have at least learned how to mimic it. So if you have an emergency in the cockpit, you're not freaking out saying, oh my God, what are we going to do? You are able to control that initial instinct and then deal with that later. The other thing pilots have a common thread with is they're generally introverts, but they exhibit extroversion behavior. Basically, pilots exhibit more aggressive behavior, but not necessarily in a bad way. It just means that pilots are much more willing to share their opinions. So a lot of pilots are willing to speak up, and that's part of a safety factor that's actually important to have. They also have an earned self-confidence and ego. And once again, there's usually a bad connotation with that, but in this case, we're talking about a good thing. Pilots need to have that internal knowing that they can get through any emergency, they can get through this flight. And it's also part of, I know there's some flight instructors listening, so it's also part of you teaching your students how to have that too, and to build on that confidence is a big part of being a pilot, and it's a big reason why a lot of student pilots wash out. The other connection is multi-dimensional thinking. It's just that ability to think in three-dimensional space. Driving a car, we're left and right. In an aircraft, you've got 360 degrees to think about. It's also like when you're shooting an instrument approach, you don't really think about it, but think about all the information that's coming into your brain. And your single brain has to then react and do a physical reaction on that. So thousands of pieces of input coming in at one time. Pilots are good at taking all that information and making one action out of all of those inputs. And then the bad part of all of this is that none of these characteristics can be determined from a multiple choice test. And so what do we do with our pilots? We give them multiple choice tests to weed them through the steps of their learning. So especially as a teacher, I've learned that's not a good determination of what makes a good pilot. I've flown with some really good pilots who suck at taking multiple choice tests. And I hate to see anybody washing out of an aviation program because of testing. So we'll talk about a little bit more of that too. So the one thing I've stuck in here just kind of for fun is I have a whole conversation about how men and women learn differently. This is just the one piece I kind of pulled out of there, just wanted to show a contrast. So just want to talk about the prefrontal cortex of the human brain. It's responsible for the consequential thinking. And the fun part is actually larger in women, develops earlier in girls than boys. But it's that long-term thought process. It's like playing a chess game and thinking 3 steps ahead on that outcome. So men move forward much more quickly with decision making, where you'll see women will be a little bit more delayed in making an action or reaction. You can put 2 pilots, 1 male, 1 female in the same situation, and watching the end goal is the same, but how they get there is a little bit different. And it's great to have the balance of both of those in the cockpit. The only bad part about this is that it's much more sensitive to stress. So we'll talk a little bit about how stress factors in there too. We'll go back. So the problem with training for all emergencies, right, is you all know there's infinite variables of emergencies, infinite variables in just general operating of an airplane. So the hard part is that during an emergency, pilots don't have any facts. All they have is just information. So humans, we have our external sensors, and all we're doing is taking in information. We're trying to process what those facts are, but you don't have any facts until afterwards. So our human sensors fail just as much as airplane sensors fail. We've learned, in the last couple of years what happens with that. So the question is, how do we reset or recalibrate our sensors? How do we do that? From a big topic just down to two main kind of points. Trying to get pilots, especially in the simulator world, in the high-level D-level simulators, to refocus during an initial emergency on what is working, instead of focusing right away on what it is that has failed, which of course is important to determine, but also quickly determining what you have working. The great example is Air France 447, simple failure. They had a pitot tube block their, so they had erroneous airspeed indicators. Perfectly good airplane, both engines operating, ended up in the ocean, and at the point where they entered the ocean, all systems were operating just fine. So trying to get pilots to rethink that reflex and instantly taking in everything that they have working. If you've got two engines, or even if you have one engine, that's all you need, right? Then the main thing we could do is teach thought processes instead of rote actions. When we first start training pilots, it is necessary to do rote, training. That's where we have to start with. But then we're trying to get the industry to change, and as we progress and have more complicated emergencies, we're trying to do more of a training on how to think through it instead of the rote memorization. So we don't spend time thinking about ourselves and what is that one moment where you've actually learned something. We've all had that moment where something finally makes sense. Part of the way that pilots can learn how to do that is with visualization and more scenario-based training, especially from flight instructors. It's those what-if questions and getting pilots to put in their brain what a system looks like and to visualize what that entire system looks like when it fails and how does it interact with another system. So what if you were flying along and your low voltage light came on? How different would it be if it was VFR versus IFR? That kind of training to get the pilots to think about the big picture. Oops. So there's a really cool study that Drexel University did. They hooked pilots up with these electrodes and monitored their brains. They were trying to quantify their thinking, like how do we have good and bad thought processes. And so they put pilots in a simulator and had them do basic maneuvers, and they did the exact same thing, no stress or anything else additional in the actual airplane, and watch how the brain path to information changed. So the reality is, which we all know, right, is at some level our brains still know when we're in a simulator, and the fear of death is not within us when we're in the sim, even though it feels like it and it's super stressful. There's still that synapse that is laid down differently when you're in the actual airplane versus the simulator. So it was just important for us to understand how pilots access that information differently when we're put under stress. So it's kind of maybe hard to understand, so I found this really simple way of doing it. I don't know if you can see exactly what the whole thing, but so I'm going to ask you to do something really simple. And you might have already seen this experiment before, but I'm going to have you do something you've done your whole entire life. The only thing I'm going to do extra is I'm going to only give you about 10 seconds to do it, and I'll be counting out loud. So you'll hear me counting up to 10. So this is super simple. All I want you to do is read the sentence on the next screen and count the letter F. How many times do you see the letter F, okay? You've been doing this your whole life, you've been reading, but without you even realizing it, you're just under a little bit of stress. There's people watching, you've got a time limit on it. So you ready? Okay, here we go. 10, 9, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so how many got all three? Trimby got 3. Audrey got 4. All right. Anybody get 5? All right. Katie Ray did. I only have video on a few people. So how many got all 6? Anybody? So there was actually 6 F's in there. So what's your brain doing? It's skipping over the pieces of information it doesn't think it needs. It goes to the big words, the big picture, but just like in an emergency, sometimes there's those little details that we miss, and your brain is doing the best it can is trying to go to the big picture things. But just a real simple example of what stress can do to your brain, even as in a simple scenario. So there's also something that happens when we have a stressful moment, especially with our automation these days and failures, is you actually have a physical reaction. You don't really probably pay attention to it, but you also have a discomfort when your brain sees an anomaly that's not correct. So for an example, if I showed you something as simple as this, right? It's no big deal. You can tell your brain that this is just a picture with somebody with an extra set of eyes and lips. But if you sit here for a few minutes, you'll actually, your stomach will start to churn. You'll start getting anxiety. And even if you tell your brain this is no big deal, you actually have a physical response to an anomaly that's not right. So you can just imagine if you're flying along and you're, the captain and the first officer's instruments are showing something different. Not only is your brain trying to deal with it, but you're having a physical reaction as well. So just for an example of a scenario that happens in just a matter of moments, let's just say you take off in your Boeing 737 MAX, you put your flaps up, and then the trim wheel starts to activate, and all of a sudden it descends 600 feet. All of a sudden the trim wheel stops moving and the aircraft levels off. Then all of a sudden you get a stall warning and the stick shaker at the same time. Then the nose pitches over. So you turn off your electric trim, but you can't manually move the trim wheel. So you put the aircraft back into the previous condition. So simultaneously you have a stall warning and then overspeed warning. So that's exactly what happened in the Ethiopian crash of the 737, all in a matter of moments right after takeoff, right? So we can kind of sit on the ground and can see that it would have been really easy for them to just go and turn the electric trim switches off, because disconnecting MCAS, super simple. But they had all these layers of warnings that didn't comply with one particular failure. So just an example of trying to train pilots for multiple layers of emergencies. So just to kind of sum the whole thing up of the short overview of a big topic. So how do you train for infinite variables of aircraft emergencies? First thing we can start doing is removing anchoring methods of training. Anything that relies too heavily on one piece of information. So before beginning any emergency checklist, verbally state the main components that are working, not necessarily what failed. So just something that would take 3 or 4 seconds for the person who's not flying to just say, hey, we've got 2 good engines, and do a quick summary of all the systems that are working. The next thing we can just add to our training is scenario-based training. For systems training, not just in the simulator, it's super inexpensive. Trimby can do that when she's doing her flight instructing. Tell me a story. What would happen if? And then asking multiple layers of emergencies. Oops, sorry. The one thing I like to recommend, and the FAA hates it when I say this, is to take away the checklist. In the simulator, have it part of the training event, and maybe Audrey can even share if they've added any layers to this in the airline world. But take away the checklist. Have it a fail-safe event. It's just for fun. And then have the instructor put in multiple emergencies, and then tell the pilot, just fly the airplane with the emergencies. Don't even try to fix it. Just watch what the airplane can do with layers of emergencies, and then just fly it. You can find out really quickly if somebody understands a system by taking away the checklist and just seeing if they have any idea what they can do to fix that airplane without it. So one last thing we can do is maybe chunking pressured thought process into a main system first. So a big giant conclusion if a simple thing happens. So if the nose pitches over, do you have an engine issue or a trim or flight control issues? Kind of just doing a big main system first and then narrowing it down to what exactly the issue is. So this is just a short overview of a long, complicated topic, but now that we've got a pilot shortage, and well, temporarily we don't, but in general, hopefully once we get ourselves back on track, the industry is trying to run pilots through training a little bit faster. So we're having to pay a little bit more attention on how we can speed up the process and still make really good pilots out there. So short overview of a big topic. So from here, we can just kind of open it up for questions.